going to try to cut 9 minutes off of it, but if you don't want to be here until 10 o'clock, hold the questions till the end. Okay, it's 7:01. We good? Okay, welcome everybody to the Cathedral lecture series on creation, evolution, science, and the church. I know this is a pretty heavy topic. I'm impressed that so many people came out for it. Like I said, if we had done a series on understanding Pope Francis, it would have been standing room only, but I'm really glad that so many of you came out for evolution and science. That's awesome. So, we're going to jump right into the purpose of this. What we're going to do in this series of 3 lectures, we're going to investigate the relationship of the church and science. We're going to try to get that right and precise so we understand it well. We're going to discuss the proper use of Scripture. We're going to investigate the major and popular explanations for the origin of plants, animals, and people, and there are several. We're going to distinguish between them. And then we're going to examine any challenges to Catholics posed by each of them. And spoiler alert, there are challenges to Catholics posed by every possible explanation for the origin of life that mankind has so far come up with. There is no one easy answer to this. So that should be going into this. This is a complex topic. It's going to take us some time and some effort to work our way through it. Before we get into the issue of the origin of plants, animals, and humans, we're going to go through some examples that have nothing to do with biology, but we're going to do that so that we can start to use and understand the relationship of the church and science so that we're thinking correctly about these topics using non-controversial examples before we dig into the tough, controversial ones. What we're not going to do, we are not going to have a debate in this room. Anyone that came here with your Bible or your copy of The Origin of Species and you want to beat up on somebody, take it to the internet. There's plenty of places on the internet that you can have a big old fight with somebody on this topic. It happens 24/7, 365. I've been there many times. It's fruitless, but if you want to go do that, feel free. The other thing that we're not going to do, we're not going to brand anyone a heretic over this topic. If you've come here to hear that your neighbor that believes a certain thing you disagree with is definitely a heretic because of it, you're going to be disappointed. So, we're not going to do that. And you'll find that I like Calvin cartoons, so you'll see a few of them popping up here and there. So, if we're going to talk about the relationship of science and the church, I'm going to presume, because this is at the Catholic Cathedral, I'm going to presume that most people, even non-Catholic observers, know what the church is. So I'm not going to spend time explaining what the church is. If you don't know what the church is, go see anybody with the black and white collar on running around here and they'll be glad to explain to you what the church is. What we need to tackle in here is what is science so that we understand the relationship between the two. So, and we're going to start in a very, very basic way. Much to my dismay, I found out that we actually have several scientists in the audience tonight. I will try to do my best to present on your area of expertise. Please be patient while the rest of us catch up with you. We're going to start very, very simply. So, what is science? Science is the study of nature. Oh, and by the way, we could use technical scientific terminology. We could use correct terminology for this, but we're not going to. This is a popular level presentation. We're going to try wherever possible to use simple, popular terminology. We're not going to try to multiply syllables for the sake of doing so. So I'm going to explain everything as simply as possible. So, science is a study of nature. What is nature? The natural, physical, material world and its phenomena. Right away, as Catholics, we should see that this is in contrast to something. Nature, the natural world here, is in contrast to the supernatural. Science studies nature. Nature are things that happen, nature is things that happen naturally, not supernatural things that happen supernaturally. That's a simple distinction, but it's probably the most important thing. If we can get that at this point during these presentations, I think everything else will be very, very simple and easy for us. Science seeks to understand nature, that is the natural world, and test these understandings with predictions. We will be seeing over the course of this presentation how this works, how science operates in a very general sense, so that those of us that are non-scientists, like myself, can understand the scientific endeavor. As Catholics, there's a particular belief that we need to understand, which is foundational to our Catholic understanding of the natural world. We believe in the laws of nature. We believe that this is how the world is created. It's created with laws that govern it. Not every religious group shares this. In particular, it's worth noting, for the purposes of our course, that some Islamic belief, because some aspects of Islam are inherited from Judaism through the Old Testament scriptures, which Muhammad knew. Muhammad had learned from his uncle, for example, and ancient Jewish beliefs, which are sometimes reflected in modern ultra-Orthodox Judaism, they don't share this. Those are two groups, just as an example. There are others. Those are two groups that believe in something called perpetual creation. The idea that God didn't just make the world once in past, but that God remakes the world in every instant. And if God remakes the world in every instant, then everything that happens, happens because God's willing it to happen right now. And that's different than the Catholic belief. I'll give you an example. If I threw this into the air, if I was a better catch, I could do it and demonstrate it, but I'll probably miss. If I threw this into the air and I watched it make an arc and come back down and fall back down into my hand, and if you ask a Catholic, why did that happen? A Catholic will say, well, the laws of nature dictate that it'll go up and come back down. But if you could go and find an Orthodox Lubavitcher Jewish rabbi in New York City or in Jerusalem, you would find that at least some people in that community, apparently still, would say the reason that it went up and came back down is not because of the laws of nature, it's because that's what God willed to happen. That everything that happens, the simplest physical aspects of the universe, everything happens because God wills it to happen right now. And if you go and you read some modern Islamic teachings, you can find this is still, in at least parts of Islam, this is still a current teaching. The idea that there are no actual laws that govern the universe, but that everything that happens, happens because God decides in that instant that it will happen. It's important to understand the difference between these two belief systems, because as Catholics, if we're going to have a right relationship to science, we first have to understand that science can exist. Science studies nature, which is governed by the laws of nature, which means that science is studying natural causes and effects. If there are no laws of nature, then there's no cause and effect. Anything could happen at any moment. Whereas the Catholic belief, which is the general Western belief of Western society, of all technological society on the earth today, is that the laws of nature are predictable, that God has created a predictable universe. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, we believe in a predictable universe. If you wanted to have theological terminology for this, we Catholics believe that the universe proceeds virtually all the time by God's passive will, that God allows the laws of nature to run the universe. Whereas the other beliefs that we're talking about particularly would say that the universe is remade in every moment by God's active will, what God decides definitely to do in this moment. This distinction between God's active and passive will is an important one. Particularly as Catholics, we should be aware that if there are no laws of nature, if there is no repeatability to the universe, then everything's a miracle. And there would be no way to recognize one event as a miracle. So I've got an illustration here. I have an icon of Christ walking on the water. And we as Catholics immediately recognize, and we say, yes, I recognize this. You know, this is the miracle of Christ walking on the water. Why is it a miracle? Well, because we know that there are laws of nature, and particularly the laws say, and we know empirically, that if I stepped onto the water, I would splash in. If any of you stepped onto the water, you would splash in. We could repeat this experiment as many times as we liked, and we will always splash into the water. the fact that we recognize that this is the normal course of the universe running according to the laws of nature, it gives us the ability to recognize a miracle. God's action by his active will when he intervenes or suspends the laws of nature. When a man walks on water, we say, this is not the normal course of things. This is not the universe proceeding according to the laws of nature. This is different. We call that a miracle. Does that make sense? Okay. So, what's an application of this? Well, as Catholics, we believe that the virgin birth was a miracle, right? Have you ever heard, more likely, we've all done this, so when somebody shows you a baby photo of the new baby, a lot of things you can say. You say it's a cute baby, a lovely baby. You don't say what you're thinking. It looks like Winston Churchill. Instead, you say, oh, it's a miracle. Is that actually correct Catholic theology? Is that baby's existence a miracle? No, because babies are born in the natural course of events all the time. Medical science can now express to a very high degree of accuracy how the baby is created through the egg in the sperm cell and through gestation in the womb and through birth. These are natural, very complicated processes, but natural processes. If that baby was a miracle, and every baby is a miracle, then we remove the Christ child. We remove the miraculous nature from his birth. Only Christ's birth was a miracle. It was not in the normal course of events. What was not normal about it? Well, there's no earthly father involved. We believe in the virgin birth of Christ. So, particularly, what happens in the course of nature is natural. Miracles are things that suspend the course of nature or suspend the laws of nature. Now, I know I'm belaboring this point, but believe me, this is important. It's foundational to the church's relationship to science and everything else we're going to talk about. And I know we have that desire when we see something really cute, a baby or any little animal with big eyes and big ears, and we say, a miracle. But we need to think and say, okay, I don't mean that technically, because I know that when the puppy is born, that's natural. So, let's make a practical example of nature versus miracles. And this is where we're going to start going from the purely theoretical to things that we deal with in our own life. So, I would like to know what the weather is going to be on Friday. Have a trip planned, need to know what the weather is going to be. How would you suggest that I find out what the weather is going to be like on Friday? Any suggestions how I should find out? Internet, okay, good. I could probably take my cell phone, look at AccuWeather. Is that a good suggestion? Yes? Does everybody in the room agree that if I want to know what the weather is going to be like, I should consult a source of meteorological information, right? Right, right. Your favorite meteorologist, Joe Bastardi on the Weather Channel, you know, anybody you want to go to. Why? Why would you Catholics say that? Why would you say that if the Bible clearly tells you that God causes the weather? Why does this not create a terrible conundrum for you Catholics? Why are you all very, very happy with this suggestion that we consult the science of meteorology when very clearly here I can show you, and I can multiply Bible verses again and again and again, that shows very clearly that God creates the weather and that God creates the weather directly? Why are you Catholics not scandalized by this? Okay. In the same way, does anyone here believe that Thor causes thunder? No. Put your hand down. You're a catechist of the church. I know you don't believe that. We understand that as humans, we make progress. We understand that. And we don't hold people responsible for what they couldn't know. In the same way that we don't think that it's unnatural or in some way wrong that the ancient Nordic peoples believed that their god of thunder was ringing his hammer and was making the thunder and the lightning. That was the best explanation available at the time. We also don't think that it's unnatural that the ancient Hebrews, not having access to modern scientific techniques, would believe that God was actively controlling the weather at all times. If you have the ancient Jewish belief, the monotheistic belief that there's one God and he created the universe. What would be more natural than believing that God ran the weather actively? Can we all see this is expected and natural? And there's no particular controversy about this for us. You know, there's a whole history of the development of weather science, of all of these principles that were discovered. Men with great names like Philo of Byzantium and Evangelista Torricelli, who invented the barometer. Robert Boyle, George Hadley, my favorite, Gustav Coriolis, who discovered the Coriolis effect. These scientists throughout history have advanced our understanding of weather science and given us the ability to some degree, even predict what the weather will be. But there was no way to make it happen for real until we had a way to communicate that was faster than the weather could move. When the only method of communication that we had was horseback, was the fastest thing, our messengers couldn't travel a whole lot faster than a thunderstorm. So even if we had been able to predict the weather, we couldn't ride out ahead of it and warn anybody. Once the telegraph was invented, then all of the theoretical science that had gone into the weather topic could now be tested against predictions. We could predict the weather and see how correct we were. And so it's only in a very, very modern time period that meteorology really exists as a predictive science. And so meteorology doesn't cause us any heartburn. It's a modern thing. It's slipped in under the radar without controversy, and we all accept it. And no one ever thinks of this as a problem. We don't believe in Thor because we know that thunder is the sound waves that come off of the passage of a super hot bolt of lightning, which is electricity. We know that thanks to Ben Franklin. We know how these things work. We understand convection, conduction, radiation, all of these things. And we can, as human beings, replace the direct action of certainly the thunder god, or more seriously, we can replace what we thought of as the direct action of God on the weather with an understanding of the laws of nature. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. The natural operation of the weather is now understood to a very high degree, and we all agree we should go to the weatherman because the weatherman probably knows what the weather is going to be. Most people do this. AccuWeather is a very popular website. The Weather Channel is a popular network. Most people do this all the time. Most of the time. When do people not do this? Think about that. When do people not do this? Catholics usually have no issue with this. Most people typically go to the Weather Channel. It's important that we understand this because this understanding can preserve Catholics from mistakes about God. What are those mistakes? I've picked the most tear-jerking photo I could find of the little boy crying over his teddy bear to point something out. As Americans, particularly as American Catholics, we're pretty good about being consistent, about understanding that God doesn't run the weather on a day-to-day basis until a disaster happens, and then we get tempted. We are tempted to drop our rational thought, and we're tempted now to see the weather as God's direct action. We Catholics, we fall prey to this sometimes. Non-Catholics have more of a problem with this than we do. How often does God directly control events like the weather and disasters? This is a nationwide poll done this year by an international polling firm that probably doesn't care one way or the other what the results are. 31% of Americans said all of the time. 31%. A third are essentially here. God controls the weather all the time. That's what this essentially says. So we're 36% say most of the time, 45% most or some of the time. This is a temptation that people experience when there's a disaster. I think that everybody remembers Hurricane Katrina, and Hurricane Katrina was such a visible weather disaster with so many stories of human suffering that came out of it, and it was so close to home. We probably, I'm sure everybody has at least met a refugee of Hurricane Katrina. I was part of a parish effort to take canned goods down to one of the refugee centers in San Antonio. And boy, that was a big problem. We got all the canned goods together and went down to the refugee center because it was being handled like a traditional disaster. There were going to be thousands of people there for months and months homeless. But what nobody took into account is that Katrina happened in the era of the cell phone. By the time we got the canned goods down there, it was almost empty because everybody had called relatives on the cell phone, and the relatives come pick them up. It was really interesting to see how communication affected disasters that way. But anyway, I remember Katrina, and I remember even in the Catholic parish, people saying, well, you know, that town's immoral. It's always been immoral. And then, of course, whenever there's a big weather disaster, we have notable non-Catholic personalities and ministers that get on TV, and it's like the regularity of a metronome. You know what's going to happen. If people die in a weather disaster, you're going to have certain visible Protestant ministers are going to render a moral judgment on these people. Now, this is all of the hurricane tracks in the Atlantic for the last 150 years. I would like to challenge anyone that believes that God actively controls the weather to show me which town God likes the least. Now, if you look at natural disasters with storms on the East Coast and hurricanes on the West Coast, I would say God's favorite town is probably Las Vegas. I don't think any Protestant ministers that are interested in God controlling the weather will agree with me that God loves Las Vegas. On the other hand, Las Vegas is pretty much natural disaster free. This is a very boots on the ground example of how our understanding of the natural law governing the world and the universe is important to us Catholics. This is something that our church gives us. This is a development of our theological understanding, which has been hard fought. It was not easy to come to this point. We're going to be talking about how difficult it was for us to get to this point. There's a lot of pain that went into this to come to understand this. Coming from our Jewish roots in a pre-technological age, a pre-scientific age, developing our theology to the point where we can look at this and say, this makes sense to me on the basis of my religion. I can look at this and I can say, this comforts me because I am not having to explain to myself or to anyone else who God likes and who God doesn't like. Instead, I can say, God loves all, but hurricanes happen because this is a dangerous natural world. This is a consistent theological understanding that, like I said, it was very difficult to get to this point. We should never let it slip away easily. So, who taught this understanding to us? Well, Jesus taught this to us originally. If you ever need an example or a concrete example of why the church needs to renew itself from time to time and get back to the basics from time to time, this is a really, really good example. Because the teaching that natural events and disasters are not God's vengeance upon any particular person was given to us by Jesus. I like the one from Luke chapter 13 because it was a current event. Siloam is the lowest part of Jerusalem, down at the bottom of the hill, and there's a pool there that shows up in the Gospels, the pool of Siloam, down at the bottom down there. It was a water source. And apparently there was a tower that was being built there at Siloam, and it fell over and killed some people. It was a current event in the first century. And so you can see the same temptation that falls upon Americans when there's a hurricane that mows over somebody's city. This same temptation happened to the first century Jews. And Jesus corrects them. Of those 18 people who were killed when the tower at Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than everyone who lived in Jerusalem? And then he says no, and he says, and if you're not careful, you're going to end up just like them. That's that nice, cuddly, fuzzy Jesus. This is a very plain teaching. And then Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, he makes the sun rise on the bad and the good and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. And this is in contrast to what we were reading. I also withheld rain from you when the harvest was still 3 months away. I sent rain on one town, but withheld it from another. That's the ancient Jewish understanding. Christ corrects this. This is why we are Christians. We're not Jews. It's a very important distinction. We're members of the New Covenant. We are interested in that teaching. We know what our history is, but we're not trying to be ancient Jews. This is something that Catholics Catholics are actually very good at this, and some other Christian groups lose this from time to time. And we'll be talking about that, about the why and the history of that. Does this all make sense? Okay, so from now on, when a hurricane mows somebody's city down, everyone needs to resist the temptation to blame it on those people. What I especially like in John chapter 9, this same principle comes out. The apostles, they're walking through Jerusalem with Jesus, and they see a blind man, and they ask the same question from a very Jewish mindset, and they say, Master, he's blind. Is it because he sinned or his parents sinned? The idea that this was the result of sin, God's active will. And Jesus says, neither. And what does Jesus do? Heals him. There's the template. When a hurricane mows somebody's town down, you don't say, ooh, was it because of their sin? You say no, and you start gathering together canned goods. You start trying to heal the wounds, right? That's what Catholics do. It's what we're good at. Now, I said, I know I'm belaboring this point, but I really want to get this across that this is foundational Catholic teaching so that we don't slip into any problems along the way when we're discussing more controversial topics. What can we learn from all this? Pope John Paul said it very, very well. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Error and superstition would be saying the hurricane mowed this place down because it's evil. That's error and superstition. Okay? And we're going to see error and superstition all along the way, and we're going to point out some places where certain Catholics fall into error and superstition. We're not going to call them a heretic because of it. We're going to say, well, let's try to learn. Let's try to learn from their example. Whether it's good or bad, let's try to learn from it. And also, religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes, which is sorely needed. And we'll get to that later on. We'll talk about we'll talk about new atheism particularly, and whether a world of biological understanding is a good reason to be an atheist. And that's where we're going to see if religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Although, I should say at this point that science, if it is done correctly, purifies itself from mistakes. So, we're going to look at these processes. It's very interesting. So, I have on there, and so on to Galileo. We can only go on to Galileo if we have a firm understanding of the laws of nature and how the universe operates, and that God doesn't take his finger and make it rain here. That is an archaic Jewish understanding. It's one of many things that we don't carry over from ancient Judaism. Does that make sense? All right? And then on to Galileo. Galileo is fascinating. Galileo is a great human interest story, great scientific story, where there are no real heroes. Makes it an actual real human story, right? No real guy in a white hat. So Galileo, the picture that I have here particularly is Galileo holding up two lenses. Galileo was so smart that when he just heard from a traveler that the Dutch had invented something called a telescope, he thought about it, and with no drawings, nothing else, he started grinding lenses, and within a few days had a working telescope that was apparently the best one in the world at the time. He'd never seen one. That is brilliance. He's a man of the Renaissance and a true Renaissance man. I think I have some Galileo, yep. So Galileo went to university on scholarship when he was 17 years old to study medicine, and he was forced to leave. He was a very, very rebellious person. He was basically asked to leave university, and then 4 years later, he went and did independent work. And within 4 years, he had so distinguished himself that he ended up getting hired as a lecturer and professor at the university that had kicked him out 4 years earlier. He's an amazing, amazing person. One of the things that he did, he actually discovered that a pendulum can be used to keep time. Think about what a foundational discovery about the natural world that is and how useful this is. He's called the father of modern physics, the father of modern astronomy, and often the father of modern science. So we'll go back to Galileo. Galileo is an amazing guy, but remember, he was kicked out of the university. And being kicked out of something, it's never high praise when you were kicked out of something. If you're a scholar and you're kicked out of the university, you know. I narrowly avoided being kicked out of university a few times. That should tell you that I wasn't the greatest scholar in the world. I got my diploma. I wasn't quite as rebellious as Galileo, but I'm not as smart as he is either. What's the debate? Oh, yeah, it's also kind of interesting. He's from a brilliant family. His father was one of the first theorists of music, and a tremendous amount of what we know about music theory and the mathematics of music was developed by Vincenzo Galilei. He's also from a very religious family. Galileo had a daughter. He had several children. He had a daughter who was a nun, and he actually moved at the height of his career, when it was very difficult, he moved across Italy to be near his daughter's convent. So this is a loving guy, a loving father, a religious man, and a brilliant, brilliant guy who was apparently very headstrong. So, the debate, the famous debate. A lot of people know that something happened to Galileo, and they know that the church was bad to Galileo, but if you dig into it, here's the meat and potatoes of it. Heliocentrism. I couldn't figure out a way to make that word any simpler. Helios, that's sun at the center of the solar system and the universe in this case, versus geocentrism. Geos, that's earth, the earth in the center. This is a very, very simple geocentric diagram. I had to have something simple so that you could see it on the screen. But I want to start out right now by saying don't fall prey to the error of sneering and being snide at people who thought the earth was at the center of the universe. Galileo lived and worked in the second half of the 16th century and the first part of the 17th century, in the 1500s and the 1600s. Okay, that's when he lived and worked. Before his lifetime, the earth at the center of the universe was standard. That was what everyone accepted. When did Columbus sail across the ocean blue? 1492, before Galileo. Magellan, sailing around the world before Galileo. When they were doing their navigation, what system were they using? This one. Right there, that should give you pause and say, oh, that may not have been just a silly superstition. There may be something to it. We'll talk about, go back a little bit. Right. Geocentrism, as it existed at the time when Galileo began operating as a scientist, was 1,500 years old, 1,400 years old basically, and it was a very rigorous mathematical system that had been worked on by some absolutely brilliant people over the course of history, and it was useful. It was useful. There were errors to it. For example, one of the reasons why there was so much interest in examining this system during Galileo's lifetime was because the calendar was off. It obviously didn't account perfectly for the calendar, because the calendar, as far as matching up with events of the sun and moon, had gotten 10 days off roughly over the 1,500 years it had been in use. So people could tell there were errors to this. It wasn't perfect. This geocentric model, as well worked out as it was, wasn't perfect. But it was the tried and true system for navigation, and this is really, really important, it also fit common sense observations. I would like for somebody in here, if you can, in a few minutes, to demonstrate to me that the Earth is moving at thousands of miles an hour. Go. Okay. There's no way to easily do that. Without very complex science, that is a modern invention. Galileo is the first herald of that. Without complex science, it's virtually impossible to prove to someone that the Earth is moving. There is still in existence in the world a geocentric society. It has thousands of members. There's a conference every year. A geocentric conference goes on, and I'm embarrassed to say there's a lot of Catholics that go to it. There's actually a Catholic that sponsors it, and it's called Galileo Was Wrong. And the first best proof that they have is they say, obviously we're not moving. And they go on to many, many mathematical proofs, which those mathematical proofs of geocentrism exist because for 1,500 years, since the ancient astronomer Ptolemy, people have been working out the math. And the math worked pretty darn well. Now, there were errors in the calendar and observations which didn't add up, observations which didn't hold to the Earth being in the center of the solar system. And it's important to note, it was intended to be the center of the entire universe in the Ptolemaic system. Everything rotated around the Earth. Every single thing in the universe rotated around the Earth in the Ptolemaic system. And all the math was worked out very, very closely. Observations were starting to add up that this was not in fact true. Alternative systems began to be suggested. The first one, the very famous one, is the Copernican system. Copernicus was a Polish, he was a cleric. Whether he was ordained to the priesthood, people argue about that, but he was a Catholic, a believing Catholic. And he formulated the first model that had the sun at the center, but it was still very old-fashioned. We're operating here a long time before Isaac Newton formulates the laws of universal gravitation. So if something's going around something else and we don't have this idea that gravity's holding these things together, there has to be a reason. And Ptolemy's idea was that there were actual crystal spheres, transparent spheres, that things were stuck onto, and that these spheres were a real thing. And this is what rotated. And at the time, scientists would build models. You may have seen these things. They're called astrolabes, and they have gears, and things are on spheres, and they actually look a lot like this, and they show the motion of the spheres. Have you ever heard astronomy described as the motion of the spheres? That's something used to be said, the motion of the spheres. The spheres were presumed to be actual real things. Don't sneer at this. This was the best possible explanation. And when you think about us, we believe in gravity, but it's not something we can see. We're trusting some pretty arcane mathematics there. So, this was the model, and in Copernicus's model, there were still crystal spheres. He also presumed, based on his knowledge of ancient Greek philosophy, that everything in the heavens was perfect and unchanging. So these spheres were perfect spheres. Everything was a perfect circle. And so this system, it honestly didn't work as well as Ptolemy's old-fashioned geocentric system. He put it out there. The books were published right about the time that he was dying. People started looking at it, and it just didn't work as well. It was an intriguing idea, but honestly, Ptolemy's old-fashioned ideas could still be used to navigate ships, and they explained things, pretty well. So then we have a halfway system. Tycho Brahe, who was an interesting guy, had his nose cut off in a duel and wore a metal nose the rest of his life. If you ever see a portrait of Tycho, he's got this metal nose. You'll never mistake him for anybody else. He suggested a system that was kind of halfway. It was planets orbiting around the sun orbiting around the Earth, but the mathematics didn't work out perfectly there either. And then Kepler, Johannes Kepler, who was from Austria, he developed a system that was not based on perfection. And this was the thing. His system worked mathematically, but it didn't have perfect circles. It had weird egg-shaped orbits, right? And so these were things that were imperfect. And he corresponds with Galileo because Galileo is at an important university there in Padua. And he sends him a letter and says, look what I've discovered. Galileo becomes aware of it. Galileo builds his own telescope. He observes these things, and Galileo says, gadzooks, he's right. And Galileo becomes absolutely convinced that Kepler's right. Which system do we rely on today? Kepler's. Which one does NASA use to calculate orbits to send probes to distant planets? Kepler's. Right, Kepler's laws of planetary motion. So we know, spoiler alert, we know who was right. But I want to give you a sense for the fact that at this time, this was not certain. Certainly it was not certain to anybody except Kepler and Galileo. Kepler was a little bit afraid. He was afraid to be a firebrand about this because Kepler was in Austria. And what was the important thing to know about Germany and Austria at this point in time, about 100 years after Martin Luther? They were Protestant. The most vocal opponent of heliocentrism in Northern Europe was Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a Ptolemaic geocentrist, and nothing was going to change his mind. Kepler stayed quiet in Germany and Austria because he was afraid of the Lutherans. Galileo started out by staying quiet in Italy because he was a little bit afraid of all of his fellow Catholics. They would converse back and forth, and they would try to gin up each other's courage, and the one would say, you should speak up, and they'd write back and say, oh, you should speak up. This indicates the kind of environment that both were in. I wish I could say that, oh, it was so much better for Galileo being a Catholic, but I can't honestly say that. In both places, there was a problem. Because geocentrism was so old and so well accepted, it was a system of perfection, and it worked out. It was widely accepted, and there was no reason for it not to have been up to this point, that this is what the Bible was talking about. That when the Bible said that the earth is fixed and firm, that it really meant the earth is in one place and everything's going around it. This was a common belief. It's really important, I think, not to sneer at people in previous times, but instead to try to understand, well, why wouldn't you think that? If nobody had presented anything that was superior, why wouldn't this be a natural thing? Can we all see that? Can we empathize enough with people? Particularly when we look at the timeline. Galileo is sentenced to house arrest. This is what happened to Galileo. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest. The great scandal of this is that Galileo was arrested, confined to his quarters at this point during his life. When did this happen? It happened in 1632. When did Kepler finally form his real good watertight? 1627. 5 years. Only 5 years had passed since the work had been done. I'm not certain if we in modern times could react that fast. We have a hard time reacting. We're natural humans. We get used to things. We get used to ideas. This is awfully demanding. And this is something to know. Galileo is a demanding person. So when you hear the story and you say, the Pope locked up Galileo because the Pope believed in geocentrism, the Pope was wrong. Okay, well, on the bare facts of it, yeah, but Galileo is asking the world to shift tremendously, and he's asking the church to purify some of these doctrines that have been around for a long, long time. I'm also going to empathize with the Pope. I'm going to empathize with the Pope because this is a difficult thing. So, Galileo made several separate discoveries which helped to put the nails in the coffin of geocentrism. He discovered sunspots. Well, what's important about sunspots? Well, that Ptolemaic model was based on perfection, right? What's a sunspot? It's an ugly blot on the sun, right? If you've ever seen a picture of them or hold up the paper behind the telescope and look at sunspots, they're ugly black blots on the sun. The sun, if it was perfect, it was the perfect example of God's light, right? Well, it couldn't have sunspots. This was something controversial. Galileo said, well, if the sun has sunspots and the sun's not perfect, this is one more nail in the coffin of this ancient system. He discovered the moons of Jupiter and watched them go around Jupiter. Well, what was important about that? It meant that there was something that didn't go around the Earth, right? Again, he's putting a nail in the coffin of the perfection of the system. He discovered all of these things, and then he said, because I've discovered them, you all need to accept this. And the fight was on. And I want to make this important point. When we think about someone resisting the church, we tend to think in a modern mode, and we think, oh, atheist. Galileo was not an atheist. Galileo was a good Catholic. Galileo took things so seriously as a Catholic. Here's an example of one of the things that he was fighting against. So this story from the Old Testament, this is Joshua, and he's leading the Israelites in battle, and they've been winning the battle all day. And I forget whether it was the Amalekites. He was winning the battle, and the sun's going down, and he needs more time to finish killing all of his enemies. So he prays, and he holds his hands up, and he says, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on its enemies. Galileo is arguing with a faction in Rome about this. Nobody was arguing and saying, this never happened. Some of the cardinals were arguing and saying, well, look, it says that the sun stood still. It says the moon stood still. That means the sun and the moon must be moving around the earth. It's very plain. And Galileo said, no, you don't understand the math. If you really understood this whole system y'all are so interested in, you'd understand that it's not that simple. You can't just tell the sun and the moon to stop because all these crystal spheres are all hooked together. nobody in the argument ever said, I don't think that ever happened. Not one person in the argument ever said that. If you had this debate today, go anywhere and have this debate today and talk about this, somebody's going to say, why are we talking about this? I don't think this ever happened. I don't think there was a Joshua. I don't think this battle ever happened. I'm a complete skeptic. None of the people we're talking about with Galileo, no one was skeptics. Everybody was Catholics. I think that's important to know. So, Galileo is arrested for this. He will not submit. Authorities of the church said, don't teach this anymore. We're afraid this is in contravention of Catholic doctrine. Furthermore, you haven't proved it. Those are two reasons they want him to quit teaching it. Galileo was stubborn. Finally, they beat him down, and he finally said, they didn't physically torture him, but they threatened him, and finally he was convinced to plead guilty. 1632, he says, all right, fine. I've been doing this in contravention of commands of the church. And then 10 years later, he dies, never having produced the proof that would prove to the Pope. He actually fought this through two papacies, through Paul V and Urban VIII. He never could convince them that they should accept it. Like I said, he was asking them to move awfully quickly. But they locked him up for a scientific opinion. Well, what does the church think about this now? Well, in 1687, Newton explains gravity, and we do away with the need for crystal spheres, and everything now starts to move really quickly. In 1757, so we're 120 years after Galileo, the church allows Catholics to start publishing books on heliocentrism and start examining the question. 1820, so now we're a couple of hundred years after Galileo, the Pope at the time allows heliocentrism to be taught as an established fact. And there's the name of the particular Catholic astronomer that was the first guy that taught it as established fact and received an imprimatur on his book. In 1835, the actual books of Galileo's that were suppressed, now Catholics can start publishing those. In 1921, the Pope at the time just says, yeah, it's fact, and actually puts a reference to it in an encyclical. And then in 1965, now we start to get contrition on the part of the church. The big, bad Catholic Church now starts to say, sorry. 1965, Vatican II. That was a radical move. That aggravated a lot of people. A lot of people think the church should never apologize for anything. The church disagreed. Pope John Paul II has been the most explicit and said many places the church treated Galileo wrongly. And here's one of his statements that he made, and I put it up here just for the quote that's in red. Pope John Paul is quoting something that was said at the time by one of the cardinals that was on Galileo's side. It was the Holy Spirit's intent to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens go. In fact, the Bible does not concern itself with details of the physical world, the understanding of which is the competence of human experience and reasoning. Experience and reasoning, doing and thinking, that's science. The natural world is the realm of science. There exist two realms of knowledge, one which has its source in revelation, and one which reason can discover by its own power. Theology and science. Two realms that are not in conflict. I know that was a long example. I know the Galileo story may not be the most interesting thing in the world, but this Galileo's fight with the church in Rome, in which the church, like I said, Galileo was asking people to change their minds about a fundamental thing awfully quickly, but at the same time, we now have the church coming to this understanding that locking up a scientist is overstepping the bounds of the church. Galileo was not making any moral, there was no moral crime here. Galileo had not committed any moral crime. Galileo was advancing a scientific theory in a very rude way, but it was a scientific theory. That's not for the church to decide. This is the path of the church coming to that understanding. This really happened. This happened in Rome. It didn't happen in Germany. It didn't happen in England. It didn't happen anywhere else. You know who benefited from this? Catholics. Do you know who didn't benefit from this directly? Non-Catholic Christians. All the way back. One reason why we have still in the United States One reason we have this is because we Catholics we benefit from this process, this very painful process the church went through to develop this understanding of the relationship between science and religion. If you don't benefit from this, if you don't have this understanding, it would be much easier to end up in this group that thinks this is the will of God. Does that make sense? That's the real value of the Galileo incident. And John Paul, obviously as the Pope, he said, yeah, we need to apologize for this, that we didn't come to this realization sooner or more quickly, especially since it was taught to us by Christ in Scripture, but we've come to it, and we have it, and we hold on to it, so that most basically, we don't make mistakes about God, and we don't assign things to His active will, which are not. And we let the weather be the weather, and we let the stars be the stars. Does that make sense? Okay. This has been a long wind-up. I really appreciate you being patient through it. What have we learned through the Galileo incident, the modern relationship with the church? Well, like we just said, Galileo was right about the science of it, and he helped, through his suffering, to form this modern relationship of science and the church. The church was cautious then. The church continues to be cautious. It doesn't mean that the church jumps on board every single bandwagon. It means the church respects boundaries. Okay? Make sense? Another quote from Pope John Paul II. The Bible itself speaks to us the Bible itself speaks to us of the origin of the universe and its makeup, not in order to provide us with a scientific treatise, but in order to state the correct relationship of man with God and the universe. You see this pattern. John Paul was very big on making sure we all understood this. But John Paul wasn't the person that first developed this idea. It was an ongoing process. There are some Catholics that think that John Paul was just wrong about that. The church should never apologize for Galileo, and in fact, the church should not care what scientists do, think, say, or discover. There are Catholics like that out there. For their benefit, I'm going to quote an old pope. I'm going to quote a crusty old pope. Pope Leo XIII, writing in 1893. Well, that was a long time before the 1960s. For some people who think that everything went to hell in a handbasket in the 1960s, this is Pope Leo XIII in 1893, and what does he say? He says, in reading the Bible, we're not to depart from the literal and obvious sense, like that the earth is founded firmly, except only where reason makes it untenable or necessity requires. What is reason? I've got the little dictionary definition. The capacity for logical, rational, and analytic thought, good judgment, sound sense. What is Pope Leo XIII teaching us? He's saying when you read the Bible, where can you depart from the literal reading of it? Where your reason, your analytic thinking demands that you do so. This is from his encyclical, Providentissimus Deus, about the study of Scripture. A lot of people think that crusty old pope like Leo XIII would have written something that says, never to depart from the literal sense of Scripture, ever. The flood covered the whole world, and every single animal was on the ark. What he actually said was, you only depart from the literal reading of Scripture where reason, human thinking, human analysis makes it necessary. We can do this. The Pope infallibly told us we're supposed to do this. And it's not John Paul II, not Paul VI, not Paul, you go back, it's Leo XIII, who was somebody who benefited from the church's experience with Galileo. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're not reading the Bible like non-Catholics. We're reading the Bible like Catholics. We're reading it with the church. We're reading it with Leo XIII. Vatican II, the Dogmatic Constitution on Sacred Scripture, the big document about the Bible in Vatican II. It's called Dei Verbum. Lays out the academic principles behind this. It says when you're reading the Bible, you need to be aware that there are different kinds of passages in all of these different books. There are historical passages, prophetic, poetic, and other forms of discourse. Catholics benefit from the church teaching us how to read the Bible. It's impossible to try to read the Bible completely literally. I grew up in that environment. So for those of you who hadn't been to a class before, I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition. I went to Southern Baptist schools in Houston, Texas, where we like to say there are more Baptists than people. And in Houston, in the Southern Baptist schools, we had a very Southern Baptist experience. I fondly remember my hardback science textbook that I had in 6th grade, which on the front cover had a picture of a caveman throwing a spear at a dinosaur, which science tells us that these beings are separated by 60+ million years. But we had this, and I remember this. This was the environment I grew up in. My dad, wanting to exert equal time with this, because my dad was a Catholic scientist, when I got home at night, when he got home at night and I was home from school, we'd watch the local PBS station together. And I'm an 80s kid, and so that was Carl Sagan, the astronomer, on PBS saying the universe is billions and billions and billions of years old, and there are billions and billions. I love the way he said that word, billions. That's my dad trying to exert equal time with the Baptists. That's how I grew up. So when I started digging into Catholicism and I read that the Bible's not all just one monolithic thing, but it's different types of passages from different authors, I'm like, finally, this is the explanation. But only Catholics have this, because only Catholics have ecumenical councils, and only we have popes. And now I hope that every Catholic is starting to see the value of this, the value of this teaching, that it really matters to us. It's something we can use every single day, this very academic, developed understanding of how these things work. Does that make sense? Then we can move on to the meat. And I'm sorry that it took an hour to get here, but hopefully you understand why we start out with the very basics. So, the origin of plants, animals, and humans on the earth. There are several explanations that compete in the popular consciousness for this. And I'll say very clearly, they compete in the popular consciousness. It would be wrong to say they competed in any other way, but they compete in the popular consciousness. And we're going to discuss all of these. And we're going to talk about the issues for Catholics with each of these. And like I said, spoiler alert, all of these present issues for Catholics. Okay? So, we'll start out. Catholics do have teaching on creation. We do have the guidance of the church. And now let's look through. This is, by the way, whenever I'm quoting things like the dogmas on creation, I try to use the crustiest, oldest sources that I can, because a lot of times you'll get somebody in the room and they'll be like, well, that's one of those things from the 70s. Everything was messed up in the 70s. Well, yeah, it kind of was. But we have all of this constant teaching. And so this is from The Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma by Ludwig Ott, which is a great crusty old book from the 1950s, which everybody says is no foolishness in Ludwig Ott. Ludwig Ott is solid, man. So the Catholic teaching on creation, what are we obliged to believe? That God created a good world, that God alone created the world, that God keeps all created things in existence, that God through His providence protects and guides all that He has created. By the way, keep your eye on that one. That God, through His providence, protects and guides all that He has created. We're going to have to parse that a little bit. We're going to have to understand what that means. That the first man was created by God. That man says, does anybody see the phrase 6 days anywhere in there? Okay? I just want to point that out. Okay? We Catholics, there are things that we're required to believe, but it's important to know what those actually are. Okay, so I want you to see that. And before we get into these origins, I want to use Galileo one more time before we let him go, because Galileo is an awesome dude, and I want to, one more time. When Galileo was arguing with all of these cardinals in Rome, and the Pope, who was, neither of the popes that listened to him were dummies. They were actually, astronomy was a hobby at the time, and both popes, knew astronomy. They were aware of this. It wasn't like they were complete simpletons. They're listening to this. The two sides, the different cardinals, are arguing with Galileo about this. And Galileo, I'm going to paraphrase this heavily. What Galileo said to them is, he said, some of you cardinals agree with me, and you say, well, of course the sun is at the center of the solar system, because God's light is always the center of our lives. And he said, some of you cardinals disagree with me, and you say, of course the earth is at the center of the solar system, because man is God's highest creation, and He's primary and the center. And Galileo said, you're both wrong. He said, you're using theology to make scientific arguments. He said, why are you using theology to make scientific arguments? He said, the universe is what it is. Let it be what it is. And he said, don't try to apply theology and make your scientific principle work out, because you can form a theological argument that sounds better than somebody else's. I want us to use that here, because we're going to be talking about the origins of life and what happens every time you get into a debate with someone. The internet, 24/7, 365, is fighting about this. Go into any debate or any time, you're going to get this kind of an argument that comes out. Well, I really believe in a God that took millions of years to do this, because that's a bigger, better, more patient God. And somebody else will say, no, I believe in a God that did it all at once in 6 days. That's a more powerful God that does that. And Galileo would say, you're both wrong. It happened the way it happened. Neither of those explanations makes God bigger or better. God's infinite. God doesn't need your opinion about how he created the world to make him bigger or better. Don't use bad reasoning. Don't use bad reasoning. Let the universe be what it is. Don't apply your theology to science. Does that make sense? I've heard those arguments 100 million times. If I had $1 for every time somebody said, well, I think that a God that does it in millions of years is just a bigger, better God. Oh, no. Galileo says you don't know what you're talking about. Okay. With that admonition, we move on. Do we have to make a decision about this? By the time this lecture series is over, do you have to arrive at an origin theory? And do you have to claim? No. There are so many statements in the history of the Catholic Church about this, but I had to pick one, and I picked the most direct one. This is Augustine. It's from one. Does everybody know who St. Augustine was? St. Augustine's awesome. If you don't know who he was, you should know. St. Augustine's a fantastic saint. So he's living in the 5th century, living and writing in the 400s. And when I tell you that Augustine already had all these debates about six-day creationism, yeah, he already had them back in the 400s. This has all been fought before. Augustine wrote a book on the literal interpretation of Genesis. It's on Google Books. You can go read it on the internet for free. I highly recommend that you do so. If you didn't know that a Catholic saint wrote that book and you just threw it into a debate and started talking about it, somebody would say, I'm not going to read that atheist book. Because what Augustine does in the 400s is he goes through Genesis and he points out all the reasons you can't read it literally. Did anybody know that Catholics were doing that in the 400s? Augustine was really, really good at it too. He brings out objections and he's like, well, this can't work and this can't work. And he brings out all the simple ones like, you have days going on before the sun and the moon exist. And he brings out all of these logical objections to why it must be poetry. Like Dei Verbum says, a poetic passage. So Augustine did that. But then he says in the book, with these facts in mind, I've worked out and presented the statements of the book of Genesis in a variety of ways. We'll get to the money quote, which is, I have thought that each one, in keeping with his powers of understanding, his reasoning, should choose the interpretation that he can grasp. Augustine knew more about this topic of creation and the literal interpretation of Genesis than anybody else at his time in the church, and than anybody for 1,000 years afterwards. And even he said, I think people should understand it the best they can. And I think people should take the understanding that they can grasp. And I said, and where someone can't understand the Holy Scripture, let him glorify God and fear for himself. Well, I hope that everybody can be as humble as Augustine. Because if you're as humble as Augustine, you're not going to take issue with someone if their reason leads them to a different opinion than you have, right? It's not a matter of dogma. It's not a matter of dogma. So, with Augustine's tolerance in mind, let's jump off into the first system. Young earth creationism. This is what I was taught as a child. This is something that was very popular. It was popular in the United States. It's still somewhat popular in the United States, really only in the USA. And it's the Genesis narrative in Genesis chapters 1 through 11 taken as being just a scientific account of exactly how things happen, which gives you a couple of things. It gives you an age of the earth, which is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years, depending on how you count all the begats. So-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and he lived this many years, and then he begat so-and-so. If you add all that up, you can do a chronology. We'll talk about that in a minute. It gives you this. It is also immediately in conflict with virtually all modern science. That should be obvious to anybody. If you've lived on the earth and you understand that there's a thing called science, then you know this is immediately in conflict with human understanding gained through scientific investigation. Even as a little kid, I knew that. I knew there was a problem here. I knew that there was a problem with this, with science as a discipline and young earth creationism. And of course, the people that believe young earth creationism also know that there's a disconnect here. There's a button that people push when they believe young earth creationism, and it was done to us all the time in school, which is the flood. The flood is the answer for everything. And I'm going to be critical about this because I lived this. I know this very, very well. The flood being a universal, global, catastrophic event, if there is something which is in contrast between scientific principles and young earth creationism, normally it's blamed on the flood. Not only were all of the sedimentary layers of rock that are all laid down, and you can see at the Grand Canyon, I love the Grand Canyon, my favorite places to go, you can see all the layers of rock, which the conventional scientific explanation for is the laying down of all these bedding plains over hundreds of millions of years. Not only were we explained the flood was responsible for that, but the flood was also responsible for carving the canyon back through it. Up and down in the same flood. Okay. Didn't make any sense to me at the time. It has never started making more sense to me now. But does this present a problem for Catholics? Well, maybe. Maybe. Each of these systems is going to present problems for Catholics. We've got to honestly say, this one does present problems for Catholics. Is this the way Catholics read the Bible? Well, it doesn't appear to be. This appears to run counter to all of the admonitions from the modern popes, the councils, from St. Augustine, from all of these Catholics. This appears to run counter. It appears to take a part of the Bible, which is best understood as poetic, and read it literally. That may be a problem. It particularly, if you're talking about applying reason to Scripture, since this is young earth creationism, I want to focus on something which is the young part. Another problem for Catholics is the age of the earth. And I want to talk about why that matters. The age of the earth. That number of 6 to 10,000, here's where it comes from. Ancient Hebrew scholars doing their calculations on the begats, they have an age. This is from now. This is how old the earth is right now. I did the math for you on this. I added the dates together. According to ancient Hebrew scholars, it's this old. The Samaritans had it. They lived just to the north. The Samaritans were those terrible heretics who lived just to the north of the Jews, right? And the Jews hated them. You know how the Samaritans, always the bad guy? You know, all right. The Samaritans had a different answer. It's one of the reasons they were terrible heretics. The Septuagint, which is the early translation of the books of the Torah and the Old Testament into Greek, it gives. It's widely agreed that it gives a date of 7,500 years approximately. Martin Luther had his own calculation because Martin Luther didn't believe anybody else is anything, and he has 5,974. The popular one, this is the one that I was taught, this is the one I was taught as a kid, actually comes from an Anglican bishop early in the English Reformation of 6,017 years. This is where the 6,000-year-old earth notion comes from. You commonly hear this, and why is because his date was calculated using, at the time, the brand new King James Bible. And of course, a lot of Protestant America uses the King James Bible. So this date is associated with the King James, and it becomes the common currency in American young earth creationism. And now here's where I want all the Catholics to note. St. Jerome, one of the greatest biblical scholars in the history of the church, the translator of the Vulgate, the original Catholic translation of the Bible, had it calculated at 7,212 years. You will occasionally, because I certainly have, you will occasionally run into a Catholic that says, well, Catholics have to believe this. St. Jerome said it. And at first you can think, gosh, do I have to believe that because St. Jerome said it? Even though all of the things we've been talking about with faith and reason and science and the church and the popes and the councils and everything, does St. Jerome trump all that? No. St. Jerome is a great saint who did amazing things. But, again, Leo the 13th, I love Pope Leo. He was so clear-minded about this. For in those things which do not come under the obligation of faith, the saints were at liberty to hold divergent opinions, just as we ourselves are. I also, from good old Ludwig Ott, in these scientific matters, there is no virtue in a consensus with the saints, since they are not here acting as witnesses of the faith, but merely as private scientists. Where Jerome talks about scientific issues, Jerome's only speaking from private opinion. This is the teaching of the church. We have it from various ways. This is an important thing, because occasionally you'll run into a Catholic and they'll say, well, I believe in a young earth because St. Jerome or St. Gregory or somebody else. That's not really how the church works. The saints are models of holiness, not of science. Does that make sense to everybody? And of course, a lot of Catholics, I don't blame them, they immediately have a desire to defend the saints. This is a good impulse, but we should defend the saints if somebody says the saints aren't holy. We don't have any reason to defend the saints in particular if somebody says the saints got some science wrong. That's all right. Now, let's apply human reason to this question. When St. Jerome calculated the age of the earth, St. Jerome had no reason to suspect that it wasn't correct, because this was the best information that he had. Do we have better information now? Yeah, let's go through a lot of it really, really quickly. So, we now know about radioactivity. We know that there are various radioactive materials that decay or run down over periods of time. There's all kinds of different elements that do this. They run down over different periods of time, some over a very, very long time, which makes them very useful clocks. And so, if you take rock samples from among the oldest rocks on Earth, which you find on the surface in Greenland, and you put them through scientific radiometric dating, which is a very well established and very well accepted scientific principle, here are the numbers that you get. Around 3.5 billion years old for the oldest rocks that we find on Earth. This is very old, and of course you see the numbers. I'll put it up here for this reason. The numbers are consistent. This is something that's been done many, 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 many times. It's been tested in many, many ways. It's very reliable. It's the most reliable kind of clock. Short-range radiometric dating. This is a neat one. This uses materials which are radioactive, but they're constantly renewed. Carbon-14. I know this is getting very, very techy, but stay with me on this. Carbon-14 is constantly made in the atmosphere because cosmic rays hit the atmosphere, and so certain carbon molecules in the air that we breathe are a little bit radioactive. You're breathing them right now. You're breathing radioactive atoms into your body right now. I just got some right there. I will keep doing that, and I will keep replenishing my supply of this radioactive carbon-14 with every breath until I stop. And then once you stop breathing it in, it starts to decay. There's no more, you're not replenishing it anymore. All the carbon-14 that's in you, it's all that you're ever going to have, it starts to decay. This makes a very useful short-term radiological clock. It's useful back to about 45,000 years, because after that, then you get so little of it left, it's no longer useful. So this is in the tens of thousands of years. So this is the thing on TV when they say, we wanted to determine if the painting was a real Michelangelo or a forgery, so we did carbon-14 dating. They took a chunk of the cowhide that it's painted on, and they subjected it to this because that cow breathed in carbon-14 and ate grass with new carbon-14, and when that cow died and was skinned, and they gave the skin to Michelangelo, the carbon-14 now starts running down. And they say, we determined that it was, 100 years old, not a Michelangelo, right? So, and they've carbon dated all these different things. It's something that's been proven again and again and again. It's part of the law of nature. It's repeatable. We can show that it's repeatable. It works every time within a margin of error, but the margin of error is not huge. It's, these margins of error are fairly small for radiometric dating. It works. Dinosaur bones did not contain carbon-14 because it was a long time ago that dinosaurs breathed in their last carbon-14. It's all run down. Glaciation and ice cores. This is a good one. This gets you a double here. Glaciation. Glaciers are snow that doesn't melt. It falls and it's too cold, it doesn't melt, so it builds up and it compresses and it compresses and it compresses into very dense ice, right? Antarctica has been sitting over the South Pole for a long time. Snow has been building up thicker and thicker and pressing down, and it's very, very, very thick. But when the snow falls, it falls when? In the winter, which means in the winter you get a layer of snow. And then all summer long, it doesn't snow, but the wind blows in from different parts of the world, and it blows in dirt and dust. If a volcano erupts that year, it blows in a lot of dirt and dust. And then the next winter, snow falls on top. And then the next summer, dirt, snow, dirt, snow, dirt, snow, dirt, snow. You get the idea. These glaciers are layered, and the layers build up one per year, dirt, snow, dirt, snow, dirt, snow. So then you can drill holes into the ice. You can drill and you can extract what are called cores. If you drill into the rock, that's what my dad's job was. My dad's job was so cool. He would fly out on the helicopter. I got to go along one time when I was 6 years old. It was so awesome flying in the helicopter over the Gulf of Mexico. And he would read these things coming out of the rocks to try to find oil. Same technique. You drill into the ice and you bring up these ice cores so that you can count the layers like the rings on a tree. The current record ice core is almost 11,000 feet long. It records these yearly cycles. You can show when Krakatoa volcano erupted in the 19th century. You can see when Vesuvius erupted and covered Pompeii. You can see all these events as thicker layers of volcanic ash on the ice. The record ice core records about 100,000 years. 100 is more than 6. This is a problem. The other thing, there is no sign of a global flood on the ice cores. There's no sign of a global flood. As Catholics, we're not bound to believe that Noah's flood was global. There's good evidence for localized flooding a long time ago enough for the Noah story to be true in the sense of its historicity, and it's perfectly understandable with our understanding of the Old Testament that we get from all these documents, all these popes, to say that the flood covered the earth. Well, it didn't have to cover Antarctica for that to be true, and apparently it didn't. There's a variety of opinions available to us about that as we've been looking. So, ice cores. Ice cores are fascinating. Ice cores, 100,000 years. There's so many other methods of dating the Earth. Varves. I like varves because varve is a cool word to say. What's a varve? A varve is on the bottom of a still lake. Like a glacial lake is a good example. It's the mud that builds up on the bottom of a lake. In the spring, you get all the runoff from all the snow in the mountains, and it scours all of the rock dust out of the creek, and it goes into the lake, and then you get a layer of rock dust. And then during the summer, the algae grows, and then in the fall, the algae dies, and the algae falls, and you get a layer of biological material. Next spring, rock dust. Then in the summer and the fall, biological material. Dust, gunk, dust, gunk, dust, gunk. And it makes layers, and they on the fall on the bottom of a lake. If you just talk about modern varves, you're talking about lakes that are actively building varves right now. You can go and you can drill cores into them, and you can get about 35,000 years of varves. If you go to fossilized varves from prehistory, then you can get millions of varves stacked on each other. In the larger scale, that's what the Grand Canyon shows you. That's essentially varves from the bottom of the ocean. Okay? Tree rings. You can even count tree rings, and you can get back 11,000 years with just tree rings. The Grand Canyon, if you scientifically date its erosion, it took about 17 million years to carve the Grand Canyon. If you allow a scientist, a geologist that actually knows what he's doing to date the erosion of the Grand Canyon. Moon rocks. There was no flood on the moon. Nobody believes there was a flood on the moon. Even if, as when I was a kid, the flood cancels everything. If the flood is the explanation for every single thing, well, why did the radiometric dating? Well, the flood messed it up. Oh. Why did the varves? Well, the flood deposited all that. Even if the flood is the answer to every single objection, there was no flood on the moon. Moon rocks are over 4 billion years old by radiometric dating. These are things we know. And there are many, many, many others, and we haven't even gotten to the biological ones where we start to date living things. We haven't even gotten to that yet. I just wanted to show you all of this because if we're supposed to use our reason to interpret Scripture, if this is what we're commanded to do, we're supposed to use our reason, then that is the difficulty that young earth creationism presents to the Catholic. I like this cartoon, the two dinosaurs, was that today, the ark going away. What is the challenge presented by young earth creationism? The challenge is presented is that we wouldn't be reading the Bible the way that we're taught as Catholics to read it, which is an incorporation of reason into our faith. That makes sense? Now, would it be heretical? Are you a theological heretic if you... No. No. You might be making a compromise between faith and reason, which is not the compromise that the popes are calling you to. But is that itself heresy? No. You're not denying any dogmas of the church. You're not denying the humanity or divinity of Christ. You're not denying the perpetual virginity of Mary. You're not denying the real presence in the Eucharist. Not a heresy. Don't call anyone a heretic. You get into a debate on the internet, go fight with them, but don't call them a heretic. Okay. We're going to do one more. We're going to do it very quickly, and then I think we'll actually be on time here. So, when modern geology is invented and people start to figure out that the earth is old, this presents a problem for young earth creationism, and so people respond. These are not in the main Catholics. Catholics, for the reasons I think we all should understand now, Catholics don't really have these problems in this way, and Catholics don't go in for these non-scientific explanations nearly to the degree that people that don't have the benefit of Catholic teaching do, but I think it's worthwhile to know about this because now you have the next development is old earth creationism, trying to reconcile the Genesis account with an old earth. This goes by another name. It's called concordism, trying to bring concord or agreement between the geologic record and the Genesis account. And there's two ways that were proposed to accomplish this. One is called gap theory. Gap theory became really popular because there was a Protestant Bible which was very influential. It was called the Schofield Bible. And if you ever delve into Catholic apologetics and explaining the church to non-Catholics and why some groups of non-Catholics all seem to hold the same kind of bizarre opinions about the church, it's because the Schofield Reference Bible, which was an early 20th century work, has a lot of these non-Catholic understandings about things. And one of the understandings you find in this very popular Protestant Reference Bible is the idea of gap theory. And you can see it right here. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then you have this insertion in the text here. It's not a verse, it's their reference from the Schofield Reference Bible, which said, the earth was made waste and empty by judgment. That covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it? Because it's not until the second chapter of Genesis you have the creation of man, sin, the fall, the effects of the fall. Instead, we need to cover up several billion years of time. We do it like this. Well, the earth was made waste and empty. Why? Well, something went down, something happened. And this is an illustration I found to illustrate the gap. The idea that something happened, Satan was involved, and it caused God to lay waste to the whole earth and let it sit that way for billions of years until you get to about 6,000 years ago, and then Genesis chapter 1 starts up. This is gap theory. It's very difficult to defend this in any way. There's no scientific defense. From a Catholic standpoint, there's no theological defense. This is created from whole cloth just for the reason of creating a concord between Scripture and the geologic timescale. But you would be amazed how popular this became because of the popularity of the Schofield Reference Bible. You can still find people that are adherents to gap theory. You can find it. You can go fight with them on the internet if you want to. I'm not going to do it, but you can. Okay, gap theory. We're going across this really, really quickly. The other way to create concord is called the day-age theory, and there are as many of these as there are people. And I know you've probably heard this. This is sort of the tuned-up modern version of concordism. This is one that's held by some Catholics, and it goes like this. Well, I think that the days in Genesis correspond maybe to what Darwin said. And I think maybe when Genesis says that first the earth brought forth the creatures of the sea, that this is where Darwin said that life started in the sea, and then when it said it brought forth creatures of the land, the idea that you can take the Genesis account, you can take those days of the creative week, you can expand them, and you can somehow pigeonhole them into modern scientific theory about the development of life. This is just one. This is a particular one from a book called The Science of God. I would put all of those things in quotes, science and God in this one. But anyway, day 1 starts 15.75 billion Earth years ago. Day 2 starts 7.75 billion years ago. Day 3, this is all arbitrary. This is completely arbitrary. Any attempt to form a concord between the days of creation and the time scale, the scientifically derived time scale of the history of the universe, is going to be arbitrary because the sequence is not the same. We Catholics don't have a problem with that. We can say, yeah, the sequence is not the same. I don't expect poetry to be science. It doesn't bother me. But if you have to form a concord, there's as many different ones as there are people trying to form them. Because in reality, it's not a scientific chronology in Genesis. And if you try to make it look like a scientific chronology in Genesis, there's going to be problems. This is just one. You can find all kinds of them, but there are people that believe this, and you can go debate with them if you want to. Is this heretical? No. Again, you could believe this if you want to. It is a problem for your reason. So take the warnings of the popes and the saints about that you're supposed to be in harmony. Your faith and your reason are supposed to be in harmony, but are you denying any dogmas of the faith? No. We can roll all the way back to those, which I think is worthwhile to do at this point. Are you denying that God created a good world, that God alone created the world, that God keeps all created things in existence? No, you're not denying any of those things. Not with young earth creationism, not with old earth creationism. You're not denying any dogmas of the faith. This is, I think, why you get the idea that sometimes when you talk about these things, Catholics have a tendency to look at these debates about young earth, old earth, Darwinism, creationism. Catholics tend to go, I know that all of my relatives, I had Catholic relatives growing up, and the people at my school were all very concerned about this. And all my Catholic relatives, I try to engage them in this. Well, do you think that dinosaurs and cavemen? And they'd go, Why? Because Catholics are more concerned. I'll roll back one more time. What are Catholics concerned about? They're concerned about this. They're concerned about what the church teaches. They read the Bible with the church, and they say, Now, in our relationship with the modern world, we are dealing with a world now which is becoming post-Christian. And what is the rallying cry of the post-Christian world? The rallying cry of the post-Christian world is science. The reason why we at the Cathedral are presenting this at all is for the relationship of the church with the world. Because if you don't already have relatives who are between the ages of 13 and 25 and are atheists who believe in science instead of religion, which is a false dichotomy and makes no sense, but you can't expect old heads on young shoulders. If you don't have any relatives that are between 13 and 25 and are atheists and believe in science, you will. You will, very soon. Or you have them and you don't realize it. This false dichotomy between religion and science is something that's it's a force in our world. You don't believe me? Go to the internet and start fighting with people, and you will find that there is a hatred of religion, and the rallying cry is science, and you hear Galileo's name all the time, and you hear Darwin's name all the time. Now, I think you can deal with any objections based on Galileo, and you can say, oh, Galileo was correct, and the church caught up with him, and the church through that learned a tremendous amount about the relationship of itself and science. And that relationship is very good today. It's very, very good today. And Galileo was part of that. I think you can deal with Galileo ones. Now, the next time around, we'll deal with the objections that have Darwin's name attached to it. We're going to be talking about Darwinism next time. What are these aspects of Darwinism? We're going to talk about this. What is a theory? What does it mean? We're going to talk about proofs of Darwinism, because you can go to a lot of places in the world and hear that there are none. We're going to talk, then again, you can go to a lot of places and hear the Earth's 6,000 years old. We're going to talk about this from a reasonable perspective, but we're also going to talk about problems which our modern understanding of the origin of life from a purely scientific perspective, does that present any problems and challenges to Catholics? We're going to talk about that because, yes, there are challenges that a Catholic needs to meet. And because I like Calvin, we're going to end with a Calvin cartoon, one of my favorites. All right, We were right on time. Thank you very much.
Oh.